My name's Denise Connis, and I'm the Mental Health Program Director at Kids House, which is a children's advocacy center in Seminole County. Our program actually works with kids from all over Central Florida. We house a child protection team, a medical trauma team, child advocates, as well as the mental health program. I've been doing this kind of work with kids in the child protection system now for over 30 years. It'll be 33 years this summer. And I have worked in this business from just about every aspect. I've been the protective investigator out there in the field, assessing, pulling kids with needed. I have supervised every aspect of child protection. Just about everything that you can do, including foster care, adoptions. I was a court liaison. Kind of the whole gamut.
Please stand closer.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Kind of the whole gamut of child protection. When I started working at Kids House, I took over as the mental health program director. I am not a clinician. I should say that right up front. I took over as an administrator. But the idea was, what can we do to make a difference in the lives of these kids and in the lives of these families? And as I started that work, I realized that we really needed animal-assisted intervention, that was kind of the cutting edge in the direction to go in to get dogs involved in what we were doing in our trauma work. So after a lot of research and really taking a look at what would best meet the needs of our dependent kids, I made the decision to pursue getting a facility dog through Canine Companions for Independence. We're going to be talking about the dogs a little bit later in our presentation, but that's me, and now Brenda will tell you a little bit about herself.
Okay, Tibet and I work with the 13th Judicial Circuit, the Guardian Ad Litem program, and we are supported by Voices for Children of Tampa Bay. They are extremely generous to basically, the only thing I donate is my time. They pay all of her operational expenses and upkeep. And they even went a step farther last fall by permitting me to be trained as a certified trauma practitioner through the National Institute of Trauma and Loss in Children. And so what that does for me is it allows me to have real-time tools to assist children that are going through difficult procedures, depositions, forensic medical exams, sexual assault exams. We split our time, Tibet and I split our time between the courts, assisting in hearings, in chambers, testimony, that type of thing. And then we also work at Mary Lee's house, our child advocacy center. So we're kind of a little bit all over the place. So the child welfare systems have been increasingly talking about trauma, what it means to be trauma sensitive, what it means to provide trauma-informed care. So for those of you that have had any of this type of training, this may be a little bit of review for you. You may learn some new things today. But let's go ahead and start with the definition of trauma. Trauma is any experience that leaves a person feeling hopeless, helpless, fearing for their life, survival, or safety. This experience can be real or perceived. Perception is reality for the victim of trauma, and we cannot assume that a child is or isn't traumatized based on their file. So I really want you guys to focus on the fearing for their life or safety, because as we talk about the neurobiology of trauma, that is going to play a critical role. And I think I'm going to have a little bit more lighting. I don't know if the guy's still around, but if we can find him. I can't even see my notes up here, so that's going to be a problem. Because humans and dogs have cohabited for thousands of years together, it's kind of hardwired into our DNA to feel that when we are in the presence of a calm dog, we are safe. And key in providing trauma-informed care, thank you, Denise, is restoring a sense of safety for that child and also introducing choice and control. And we do that a lot with the dogs. Now, if these dogs were sitting up growling or nervous, if they were showing signs of stress, if they were stress panting, if they had their ears pinned back, those types of things, then it might induce in us a sense of stress. But because of the way that they are, which is about 80% of the way they are up here is due to their purpose breeding, then we feel calm as a result of that. And we're going to talk a little bit about mirror neurons here in a little bit. The other thing we do is introduce choice and control. So we allow the children to decide if they're even going to use the dog. We certainly don't want to foist the dog upon a child that has a bad reputation or a bad history with dogs. That wouldn't be a good thing. So the dogs are there to make them more comfortable. If the dogs, for any reason, don't make them more comfortable, we remove the dogs from the area. And then we give them the choice, like one of the things that I do sometimes when we're assisting in forensic investigative interviews at our state attorney's office, sometimes since we're in an internal office, I will hand the leash over to the child. And what the attorneys have been telling me is they see the child's body language change and their confidence shoots up and they feel so empowered when they get to walk that big dog back to the office. And so it really helps a lot with empowering that child to speak their truth. The other thing I wanted to talk about, that last bullet point, we cannot assume that a child is or isn't traumatized based on their file. We really need to try to understand the child's perspective. So if we're reading something in a child's file that we think, oh, well, that's got to be the worst part of that child's experience, it may not be. We really need to sit down and get to know that child and understand what the worst part is for that particular child. We also work with groups of siblings sometimes, and they all have a different perspective about what the worst part of their situation was. So we really need to be empathic listeners and get to know the kids. Okay, so we're going to get into a little bit of neurobiology. I know you guys are super excited about that. So we're doing some auditory learning today. You're hearing me talk. We're doing some visual learning. You're looking at slides. And we're going to do a little bit of kinesthetic learning. So what I want everybody to do is hold up their right hand, right arm, and hold your right hand in a fist, okay? What your right arm represents is your spinal cord, okay? And your wrist area represents the brainstem, which is that red part, okay? And then your fist area represents the limbic system and emotional brain. And then take your left hand and cap it over your fist. And that is your neocortex. So back here where your fingertips are, that's your motor cortex. The motor cortex develops first in a child, okay? And then where your knuckles are on top is your speech area. And these are all going to come back into play here in a little bit as we talk about trauma in the brain. And then that area of your left wrist is the prefrontal cortex. And that develops last, okay? So they always say in neuroscience, a kid isn't really fully baked until they're about 25. And that should really give a lot of comfort to those of you who are parents of teenagers. I know it gave a lot of comfort to me. So the other thing I wanted to bring up about this is that the brain is, I'm going to hopefully get this thing right here. Yeah, there we go. So it is, I want you to think first floor, second floor, third floor. So there's a vertical organization of the brain. There's a back to front organization of the brain. So sometimes this is called the hindbrain, midbrain, and then the prefrontal cortex is called the forebrain, okay? That's where, like I said, a lot of the executive decision making happens. And so what happens with trauma is that we have our nice integrated emotional brain. Our reptilian brain really kind of keeps us alive. That's our fight or flight. It's our involuntary things like heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, that type of thing. And then the limbic system, again, is also that green almond-shaped thing that is called the amygdala, and that's like the smoke detector of the brain. So I might be walking along a path, and I look down and I see what I think is a snake, and my smoke detector goes off, and I start to jump out of the way, and then I realize it's a stick, okay? So that's our smoke detector, and then we have our rational brain. Well, what happens with trauma is that the system becomes overwhelmed, And that rational brain becomes no longer available for use by that child. And so they're stuck in that emotional survival, fight or flight. So that's why I really wanted you to focus on that part of the definition of trauma. Now, within the limbic system, go ahead and take your fist up again, just your right, okay? And I want you to take your first 3 fingers, and I want you to think of the acronym SAM. The limbic system is responsible for sensations, affect regulation, and memory. And so what happens is you have a child that's in a crib, and they have a sensation of hunger. So that affects their affect regulation. They begin to whimper, they may begin to cry, they may even begin to scream. And they may have one of 3 expectations. They expect a caregiver to come and take care of their sensation of hunger every single time, and that's going to result in a secure attachment strategy. Sometimes the caregiver comes and sometimes they don't, and that results in an anxious attachment strategy. And then there's the child that's neglected, and that results in an avoidant attachment strategy. And what's important to understand about attachment is a buffer for trauma. So the more secure a child's attachment strategy, the more buffered they are going to be and the more resilient they are going to be to traumatic experiences. So I just wanted to kind of give you that relationship between attachment and trauma. And I need you to tell me when I'm starting to run out of time. We probably have way more than what we have time to talk about. So what is trauma-informed care? Trauma-informed care says not what is wrong with you, okay? So instead of reading the files, learning that Johnny has ODD and ADHD and all these other Ds out there, it's about sitting down with the child and trying to figure out what happened to them. Trauma-informed care is also a continuum of care that permeates all facets of care, all agencies, all contacts with the child. Anyone not educated about trauma but in contact with that child runs the risk of providing secondary wounding to that child, and that secondary wounding can only make matters worse. So what is secondary wounding? It can come in a variety of forms, okay? Denial or disbelief. Oh, you're exaggerating. Surely it wasn't that bad. What were you wearing? I hear that a lot in depositions, okay? I hear even more, why didn't you tell someone, okay? And there's a lot of reasons kids don't tell. Statistics and the literature tells us that if a child knowingly misreports about sexual abuse, it's usually in favor of the perpetrator. Generalization, she tends to be a bit neurotic after what happened. Minimizing, the A on that one is one that I actually witnessed in a deposition. Is that all he did? Kind of like, is that why we're really sitting here wasting our time? You know, what are we doing here? So all of these things are examples of secondary wounding. I'm sure you can probably think of some of your own that you've witnessed. So the interesting thing about, I'm not going to make any assumptions here. I'm going to talk about a manual called the DSM, and it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's what mental health professionals use to help them diagnose children. And so usually what it will have is it'll have a list of symptoms, and then the clinician can try to best match that list of symptomatology with what they think is going on with that child. Well, traumatic events have their most pervasive and significant influence in the first 10 years of life, and the current PTSD category does not adequately describe children's behaviors and symptoms. So as a result, children may be given a wide range of comorbid diagnoses. So a lot of these symptoms that you see up here, you see with ADHD, you see with ODD, you see in a lot of different things. And when I first learned about this overlap, I started thinking about, gosh, I wonder how many of our kids are medicated when really their issue is trauma. And if someone could evaluate their trauma and treat their trauma, perhaps, and I will tell you, just as Denise said, I'm not a clinician, but it just kind of makes me wonder and scratch my head and wonder if that's something that we really need to be paying more attention to. Okay, going to have to jump off the stage here because I got to hit the easel. So I'm going to talk really loud. All right. So I want to talk about the types of trauma, and I want to talk a little bit about developmental trauma disorder. Type 1, single exposure. Type 2, single type repeated exposure. Type 3, complex cumulative trauma, which is typically what a lot of our kids have. So, type 1 would look like this. Kid wakes up in the morning, parents have a fight, dad hits mom, mom gets a bloody nose. First time it's ever happened, might be the last time it's ever happened, although that would be unusual. So the child's adrenaline and cortisol levels spike, okay? But then they're able to go to school and they're able to see their friends, they're able to see their nice teacher, they're able to go and do some things that they enjoy like PE class and art class and music class, and they're able to kind of process that and get all those cortisol levels down a little bit. And then there's type 2. And type 2, the kid sees it again the next morning and then the next morning. Okay? And so these cortisol levels, they keep spiking. And the nervous tissue, the brain, the spinal cord, it's very, very sensitive, fragile tissue. And every time trauma occurs with a child, it etches that nervous tissue. And so it's repeated etching of nervous tissue. Okay? And then what happens with a lot of the complex cumulative trauma is that our kids are up here and they never get an opportunity to really come down because they're living in constant chronic turmoil, trauma, maltreatment, neglect, violence, drugs, that type of thing. So what happens if there's no mechanism on the second half of this for the kid to escape and to come back down and process that, then you get PTSD. So think about your combat warriors, okay, who are in, let's say, Iraq or Afghanistan. And they can't escape that horrible situation that they're in. Their nervous systems cannot fully process that chemical bath that their brain and their spinal cord are having to go through. So that's when that PTSD kicks in. And we have kids that are trafficked and, all kinds of inescapable situations that our kids get into, and they can't process that. So that's when that happens. So developmental trauma disorder, climb back up here, was developed by Bessel van der Kolk. And if you're interested in this topic at all, highly, highly, highly recommend this book, The Body Keeps the Score. If you're interested in learning about trauma, learning about the neurobiology, amazing book. And a lot of the treatments that Denise and her team implement at a kid's house are things that Dr. van der Kolk talks about. So you're going to be seeing that again. It's also important to understand that it wasn't until about 2013 that the DSM recognized trauma for children 0 to 6 and what that meant for a developmental perspective. So a lot of this information is very, very new information. It was only about 20 years ago that the American Psychiatric Association even recognized that children could undergo trauma. So the next two slides I'm going to go through very, very quickly. I'm sure you've seen kids with these types of manifestations. Pervasive pattern of dysregulation, problems with attention and concentration, difficulties getting along with themselves and others, and rapid mood shifts. So these things could look like ADHD, they can look like ODD, they can look like antisocial personality disorder, they can look like schizoaffective disorder, borderline personality disorder, and the list goes on and on. Other manifestations of developmental trauma disorder, self-stim behaviors, difficulties with language and processing. So remember, our knuckles at the top is our speech area, difficulties with fine motor, okay? So that brain, that cortex is developing back to front, so the motor cortex is going to be affected, the speech is going to be affected. Any activity that's not directly relevant to survival is going to be a problem for these kids. And I'm going to be climbing back down to my easel here in a second. All right, so normal memory versus traumatic memory. So most of us can remember where we were on 9/11. Most of us cannot remember what we were doing the day before unless it was maybe our birthday or something like that. And what happens is when you have, let me go. I'm done. So when you have normal threat, okay, you have a nice one-to-one linear relationship.
Would you be able to hold the mic?
Yeah, if you want to bring it to me, that'd be great. Or somebody can bring me one. So we have this nice one-to-one relationship where the higher the threat becomes, the more adrenaline is secreted and the more that memory is etched into our nervous system. But then there becomes a critical mass point, okay, where we would call it trauma. And all of a sudden, there you go. Thank you. Now I got all this stuff I'm juggling. All of a sudden, you get to that critical mass, and the memory takes a nosedive, okay? So it's an overwhelmed system that results in fragmented and languageless implicit storage of images, sounds, smells, and physical sensations. Interesting statistic, and this is from Dr. Vanderkolk in his book that I just referenced. Total memory loss is most common in childhood sexual abuse, with the incidence ranging from 19% to 38%. That's pretty high. So just as trauma is stored in the sensory areas of the brain, trauma is triggered by sensory things such as sights, sounds. The strongest is smell. So a child who's been sexually perpetrated against by someone who drinks gin, not anything else, gin. They may, gin will have its own olfactory, sensory smell to it that's different from maybe some of the other alcohols. So that kid could be walking through a crowd and catch a whiff of gin on somebody else and be completely triggered. That's the strongest one. We know that gunshot wounds can be replicated with nail guns, air brakes on a UPS truck, fireworks, that type of thing. So our kids are encoding that trauma in the sensory areas of their brains, and they're triggered by sensory issues. Also, the brain is organized left to right. So the left brain is our engineer folk in the world, and the right brain is our musician, artistic folk in the world. And so because trauma is languageless, trauma tends to be residing more in the right side of the brain. So with the left brain, the way trauma affects the left brain, that trauma is languageless, the child is unable to reason or make sense of what happened to them, and learning and focus is impaired. How many of our kids are behind academically, right? The right brain, trauma memory is stored here. It's sensory in nature. Those memories are stored as iconic symbols, and they're easily activated and dysregulated. Okay, mirror neurons. I got to kind of rush this up, give Denise her time. Mirror neurons were discovered about 20 years ago. And basically, mirror neurons are what happens in our brains when yawns are contagious, okay? Or if you're watching a public speaker who is nervous and you're nervous for them. Or if you're watching a television show and the guy wipes out on the ski slope and you're like, oh, that's gotta hurt. You know, that's your mirror neurons kicking in. And the implications for us with mirror neurons are a couple of things. We really need to be attuned to our kids. We need to be empathic listeners, because if we're at court with our kids or anywhere else with our kids and we're in our phones or we're in our computers or we're in our files and they're trying to talk to us and we're checked out, we're not going to be a safe person to that kid. And as we said, trauma-informed care is all about providing a restoration of safety. And if they don't see us as a safe person, you know, that's going to provide another type of secondary wounding for them. The other area where it's very important is vicarious trauma, which we all need to be very, very careful if we want to stay in this business for the long haul, is to not be gobbled up by hearing these stories over and over and over again and having them have such an impact on us that we can't stay working in this field. One of the great things about our dogs, because they're just so worked up over here, is they provide that calm mirroring. So they really, really help the kids calm down when they're in court. So our dogs, as a result, are a sensory intervention. It's a friendly, kind face. They're attuned to their charges. You'll see feet Fritos on here. There's a very unique smell. You know, we just said that trauma is triggered by smells. And if you want to expel the bad, you have to input the good. So you have to say, oh, you know, let's notice, you know, what does her feet smell like? To me, it smells like Fritos. And Fritos conjure up lunchtime with friends and good times with doing goofy things with Coca-Cola and Fritos and all that kind of stuff. They're obviously soft to touch. They're non-judgmental. They provide unconditional positive regard. The pressure and warmth is great for grounding. They activate the social engagement system, and I didn't even have time to talk about the vagus nerve. They provide for calm mirroring, and they promote mindfulness and noticing. And just quickly, so this young guy that Tibet was, she had nestled herself in between his feet while he was sitting at juvenile court, was an autistic teen, and he was there for a juvenile court procedure. Minimally verbal, and she's just, you know, looking at him like he's the best thing going. And so it was interesting, he drew a picture, and it's kind of hard to see because it's a little bit fuzzy, but I just thought it was interesting that he's got this little bit of a, so there he is, and then he's got this big nasty mess between him and the dog, and he's saying, help me. Part 3 of 1, whatever. And she's like, okay, I'll help you. And then down here he has a little house and he has dogs and people, love to save. And so I just thought it was really interesting that given the situation that he was in, he knew he was in a tough situation and he knew that the dog was there to kind of help him through it. And so I just thought it was an interesting piece of art. I'm not a psychoanalyst, so I can't go too deep into that, but very, very cool piece of art. And then those are just a couple of pictures of Tibet at work and things that we've done. So I got to turn this over before she gets her shepherd's crook out. Thanks, we have to stay.
Okay, you see to turn this one
Off, and here you go.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Okay. We're set. Okay, I get the fun part. Brenda got to talk all about the brain stuff, and I'm going to actually get to talk about the practicality. What does this look like with our kids? We all know, I mean, I'm assuming that everybody in this room is really attuned to kids who have been abused and neglected and have seen the trauma that has occurred out there. When our kids don't get quality trauma therapy, there are consequences. They may be more psychologically vulnerable to all kinds of things that happen in their lives. They may resort to substance abuse. They may act out. They may not be able to do well in school, as Brenda had mentioned, because of the effects on the brain. There are all kinds of things that I'm assuming that you guys probably already know, so I'm not going to bore you with that. But for our kids, the kids that we are trying to help through this process, what are some of the things that you think we see in our kids that are a result of them not getting quality trauma therapy? Any ideas? Yeah.
Medication for improper medication.
Okay. We're medicating for behavior, right? What else? What other kinds of things? Yeah.
Placement breakdown.
Placement breakdowns. The kid that goes from placement to placement to placement to placement, and then we up the level of restrictiveness of those placements as we go along. Yeah.
Criminal behavior.
Right. We get DJJ involved. So then we're trying to get the two systems involved in who's actually going to be looking out for these kids. And those are some of the most challenging kids we've got to work with, right? Okay, what else?
The kids shut down.
Okay, kids shut down. Yeah, back there. Okay, issues in school. Kids that don't attach to any of their caregivers, whether it be their relative placement, the foster home, the pre-adoptive placement, the adoption. I mean, how many of us have seen failed adoptions after we get through this whole process and try to work with these kids, right? Our chronic runaway, teenagers. All of these things can be symptoms of trauma that's actually never been addressed. And so that's why it's so important for us to take a look at this. The slide talks about attachment concerns, and some of the things that we just described really do fall into that attachment stuff. John Bowlby has done a lot of research in attachment issues with kids that have been abused and neglected. And one of the things that we know is that if a child grows up in a nurturing environment that has caregivers that are actually attuned to what's going on with them and meet their needs, those child tend to be better able to cope with things that come down the pike in life. For most of our kids, that isn't really the situation that they're growing up in. And that's a problem because so many of our kids have been in homes where there hasn't been structure, where when they have been upset, there hasn't been somebody there to meet those needs. And so what ends up happening is they don't learn appropriate coping skills. They do get dysregulated very easily. They're very disorganized in their approach to feelings and behaviors. Those are the kids that are very difficult for us to soothe, very difficult for us to keep in those placements. Some of the research really supports the fact that it takes about 3 years to kind of have a child reattach to a caregiver that's safe for them. Think about our kids and how we're trying to get to permanency within 12 months. We may be able to get them through the system and put them in a pre-adoptive placement by the end of that 12 months, but are they really ready for that adoption? One of the things that we're noticing, because we're doing a lot of adoption work in the area of looking at attachments, and one of the things that we are noticing is it's becoming more and more difficult, and we're having to actually say, okay, we probably don't want to go forward with that adoption because it's probably going to disrupt unless we can really work on this attachment stuff first. And so that's part of what we're trying to do. Okay. If I'm looking for quality trauma therapy, these are some of the issues, the things that I want to look at. And I'm spoiled. I think we kind of got a state-of-the-art deal going at Kids House, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. But the rest of all of our state isn't that lucky. So some of the things that you want to look at, oftentimes you'll have people talking about location. Well, can I do trauma therapy in home? The answer to that is that's not your best option. Kids need to be in a place that is safe, predictable, structured, and where there's boundaries in place. If I'm trying to do therapy in a kid's bedroom and deal trauma work, and I've got everything else going on in the household, probably not going to get very much trauma work done. So really, we need to be looking at a child-friendly location for our therapy. Credentials and experience. When I look at who's doing trauma therapy, I'm not so concerned about credentials. Now, yeah, I'd like to have somebody to have a master's degree, but whether or not they're licensed or whether they're a registered intern that's working under a licensed supervisor, I'm not as worried about that. Do they have any exposure to our kids? Know about trauma? Have they got experience in working with trauma? That's essential. The treatment needs to be individualized and flexible. As Brenda was mentioning when she was up here with her first flip chart page, oftentimes what our children experience is very different. What one child has experienced and what they need is very different than what the next child needs. So you really want an individualized treatment plan that is going to be for that child, with a therapist who, if one thing doesn't work, they're going to try something else. And they're going to keep on trying until they actually get the right mix to make a difference. You want to make sure that there's some kind of a trauma assessment tool being used when you're looking at doing the screening and trying to evaluate the kid's needs. That could be the trauma symptom child checklist. It could be the TSCYC, the trauma attachment belief scale, some kind of evidence-based assessment tool that's actually being helped with the evaluation. There needs to be a non-offending caregiver component. If I'm a therapist and I'm seeing a child 1, 2, maybe even 3 hours a week, there's an awful lot of time that child's not with me. So having that non-offending caregiver that has an appreciation for what's going on, they understand the therapeutic process, they can support that at home, that's really important. The other thing is mindfulness activities. We want these kids to learn appropriate coping skills. We want them to learn how to deal with those awful big emotions that they've got going instead of running away. We want to be able to teach them those mindfulness activities, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Okay, but the first thing is, and got Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, I can't do trauma work if the kid that I'm talking to is hungry and doesn't know where they're going to put their head down tonight. I can't get there. So that's one of the things that we have to be really careful about. It's as adults in this system, we tend to see, okay, this child has been sexually abused and we found out yesterday and I want them in trauma therapy today. Well, it may not be really good for us to try to do trauma therapy today. We may need to have a little bit of time before we can get there because we need to make sure that all these other needs are being met. Irregular attendance is a problem when we're doing trauma work because we don't want to open this kid up and start taking a look at all these painful things that have gone on, and then all of a sudden they don't show up, and there hasn't been any resolution to that. So we always want to make sure that our kids can actually get to the therapy appointments. Environmental factors. What's going on in the family? Is the alleged perpetrator still got access to the kids? Do they have to does the child have to visit with that person? Is the child's been sexually abused, but mom was a sexual abuse victim and she was abused as a child, so is what happened to the child triggering mom? And mom can't deal with the child's feelings because every time she starts to talk to the child, it triggers her. So those are some of the environmental factors that we have to look at. Need for stabilization first, and sometimes with our kids, that does mean we have to at least do a meds evaluation. It's something that we use as a last resort. But sometimes it is going to help the child temporarily, but we really have to look at that. And then funding. Most of our families don't have a lot of money for this or don't have insurance. Now, Medicaid covers part of it, but with most insurances, it's a finite amount of time. Kids have to be pre-qualified. There's a lot of things that go into that, so that can be an issue. At Kids House, we do all of our therapy free of charge. So the families don't have to worry about that. The money that the family has, insurance is not part of the criteria that we use for acceptance or how long we keep the kids. So we've got some kids that we've seen for 2.5 years that have come every week for 2.5 years and have never paid a penny for therapy. Okay, so what works? These are the different components that we try to look at in our mental health program. We want to have a psychoeducational component. We want to be able to have kids understand what's abuse, what's neglect, what was normal. Should this have happened? Shouldn't this have happened? We're going to teach coping skills. We're actually going to get to some trauma processing, but sometimes it takes us a while before we get there. And we're going to take a look at the other needs that the child has. And that may be us advocating with teachers in the school system. That may be us really staying in close contact with their GAL, because my therapists don't go into court. Well, they can, but as a rule, we're not in a court all the time. But we stay in touch with that guardian ad litem so that they know what's going on. So if there's special needs that the kids have, if there's things that need to be brought to the judge's attention, we make sure that we've got that person that we're talking to. Okay, so at Kids House, one of the things, as Brenda was saying, we know that trauma affects the whole sensory system, the mind, the body. So we have to make sure when we're doing therapy that we are addressing all of those things. We can't just sit down and talk to the child. We've got to make sure that we are engaging with them in a sensory way and that we're dealing with mind, body sensations, the whole big picture. We do that in a variety of ways. Oftentimes when a child's abused, that the upper part of the brain that Brenda was describing shuts down, okay? That's the part that's got the verbal stuff going on. So if I'm gonna sit down with a kid and that part of their brain kind of shut down during their abuse, if I sit and I'm trying to talk to them, that part of their brain wasn't engaged when this happened. So what I have to do is I have to be able to come up with a different way for a child to actually be able to access that memory and to be able to work through that. So we do a lot of creative type work in the therapy that we do. We do individual for child and the non-offending caregivers if we need to help them parent the kids. Most of our work is done with play therapy. We do sand tray work, all kinds of expressive arts. We do a lot of EMDR. We found, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which really isn't a good title for it. But it was first developed and used with those military vets that Brenda was talking about that had the PTSD. They didn't have to relive what was going on. They didn't have to talk through that whole story. But by using bilateral stimulation of the body and being able to have them go through taking a look at what their body feels like, what's going on in their head, how do they feel, those body sensations, bringing that all together, it actually helps dealing with that trauma as you go up vertically through the brain as well as the left and right brain. So we do that a lot. And if you guys aren't familiar with EMDR, a lot of times it can be done just with using two fingers, moving in front of, and having eye movement. It can be done with a light. We use pulsars. These are pulsars. You turn them on. They vibrate off and on with the kid's hands. We can put them inside the shirt, inside socks. We have them hold it, put them in pockets as we're actually processing and doing other things to install the work. But what EMDR does is it helps us take those traumatic memories, and this is a gross oversimplification, so this is the non-clinician in me explaining this. It takes those traumatic memories where they're stored and actually helps move them to the other side of the brain so that they're not triggered. If you kind of think of your memories as in a file cabinet back here in your brain, and you open up the file cabinet drawer, and if I asked you what you had for breakfast this morning, you could open the file cabinet, you could pull out a folder, and you could say, yep, this is what I have for breakfast. You could put the folder away, shut the file cabinet drawer, no problem. Traumatic memories aren't stored like that. They're stored over here. And what we have to do is figure out a way to get them cataloged in the file cabinet, not so that the child forgets them, but the child actually can access them when they want to. It isn't as traumatic. They don't have all those body sensations going on with it. So if we do that along with our play therapy, we're kind of covering the whole gamut as far as doing our trauma work. I've got TFCBT up there. That's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. It's what we kind of think of as talk therapy, where we're going to sit down and talk about things. We don't do a whole lot of that. But we may do that if we've accessed the traumatic memories through the play therapy and all these other works. Okay. This is an example of some sand tray work. One of the things that happened after we got Jordan, kids that were used to playing with sand tray wanted a Jordan figure for the sand trays. So we finally found a dog, and that's Jordan looking at her sand tray figure at the bottom left. The picture on the right, I'm going to tell you about the little boy that did this in a couple of minutes, but that picture is actually a cave, and he is in the cave, and he's got Jordan guarding his cave so he's safe, and he wants Jordan to be safe, so he's got a fence around everything. Every other adult, other than his therapist and myself, are outside on the opposite side of the tray. They're not safe. That's what we can find with kids doing this. So what we have to do is gradually help him work with all of those feelings and identifying safe people so that he doesn't have to depend on Jordan for his safety. We'll talk about him in a minute. Okay. We do a lot of group work in conjunction with individual. We don't ever have somebody just in group. We're doing both things at the time. One of the things that we do is a creative arts group with teen girls. Helps them normalize kind of the feelings. They're not alone. Helps with self-esteem. And we do a variety of things with that. This is one of the things that we do. They're masks. This outside is what they show the world. Okay? The inside. I don't know if you can see it back there. The X is over the eyes and the mouth. Can't tell anybody about it. This one actually says shame, hate, and fear on the inside. So what we're trying to do is help the kids that feel like this and help them get through that. And with the teen girls, oftentimes that's really helpful. And by keeping them in individual therapy, we can continue to build on that. We do a Legos group with latency age boys. And it's kind of interesting because what we do is everybody has a role. There's one person that's actually going to find the Legos. Any of you guys have kids where you've looked at Legos and you have 1 million pieces of Legos around it? Okay. And then you have to try to read the directions. Well, the boys each have a role. Somebody has to read the directions, another person has to find the pieces, and another person actually has to do the building. And they have to work together. So what this does is this helps with socialization. We also turn it into something that helps them better identify what's going on in their head, in their body, and look at regulation. So we have something, a little gauge, they make it. It's called Check Your Engine. If they realize that they're getting frustrated trying to find Legos, trying to build something, the therapist will say, you know, Tommy, I think you need to check your engine. And he's frustrated, and so it's over here on the red. Okay, if my engine is revved up and it's getting overheated, that's a problem. I need to learn a skill to bring me back over here into the green. If I'm totally disinterested, my engine's cold, I'm just not engaged, not doing anything, and I'm over here in the blue, I still need to work back to that green. So what we do is when we see a kid whose engine is red or blue, what we do then is activities with the whole group to kind of bring them back to the green. But it helps them actually learn to identify what's going on in their bodies. And initially it's a little hard. The therapist sometimes has to remind them to go and check it. And so what we do is we pin these up in our group room, and so they know which one's theirs, and they can go and they can actually get it. So that's one of the things that we do with the boys. We have 3 different groups that we do with non-offending caregivers. One's a trauma education group. It's straight psycho-ed, 4 sessions. What's abuse? What's the therapeutic process? How do I support it? How do I deal with nightmares? How do I deal with these behaviors for my kids? The modified CPRT group, that's child-parent relationship therapy training. And we started this a year and a half ago maybe. And that is one of the biggest changes that has occurred with our families. CPRT really helps a parent better understand how to meet the social, behavioral, and emotional needs of their kids. It kind of teaches them how to be a play therapist at home, how to better interact with their kids. And so what we're doing there is helping them feel better about their ability to parent the child. And the kids come back and they say, you know, Mommy went to that group last night. I'm really glad she's going because it's better at home now. We're getting feedback from the caregivers that it really works. And because it works so well, we actually started a support group for people that graduated from it so we can continue to reinforce what they learned as well as introduce new skills so they have the support of each other as well as a therapist on a monthly basis. Okay. Communication is key. Being honest with the kids, being honest with the caretakers, talking with the other professionals that are involved with the kids. We do everything as a team. We review as a treatment team. I have therapists who work for me. I have a clinical supervisor who works for me that does the clinical supervision for the other therapists. But we do everything as a treatment team. We are constantly checking on what is going on. And since I have Jordan, I'm involved in a lot of the treatment sessions now. So what we're trying to do is really take a look at the overall picture of what's working with our kids, constantly reassessing and redoing treatment plans as needed. Okay. Mindfulness. One of the things that we have to do is teach coping skills for our kids, which means they've got to kind of get a read on being able to get a read on what's going on in their body. Breathing, we do lots of different types of breathing exercises with the kids, including, Brent and I have been joking up here about doing Mr. Mustache, because if you're feeling anxious and you take your finger and you hold it against, right under your nose, it actually presses in on the vagal nerve. And what it does, if you do that and you do deep breathing, it calms you down. So that's something that our kids do on a regular basis. They'll come in and they'll go, wait, stop, I need to do Mr. Mustache. And so it's a way to get them to help self-soothe. One of the other things that we do, and I don't know if you're gonna be able to see this from back here, we call these mind jars. And some of you may know about these as glitter jars. Each of the kids that comes through makes one of these. And I could go into how we do this and everything, but they entirely personalize it. But the way we introduce it is through Moody Cow. And you know, I've got a variety of things I'm pulling right here, but what we do is we read this book with the kids. And in Moody Cow meditates. Moody Cow is easily frustrated, angry, isn't getting along in school, isn't getting along with his family, it's causing all kinds of problems. And his grandpa talks to him about making a mind jar. And what he does is he explains to him how that can calm. So what happens is if the child needs to soothe, needs to calm down, they actually shake the jar up and sit and watch the glitter fall. When we're introducing that, oftentimes we'll read the book with the child having the buzzers, holding the little cow, sensory, body, mind. We pull all of that together in order to make the difference. And if you don't, if you're not familiar with mind jars or glitter jars, there's an app called Settle Your Glitter that actually combines breathing and watching glitter on your phone. So if you're anxious waiting for a meeting, download that app on your phone and that can help you. You don't have to carry around a mind jar. Heart Math is actually a sensory tool of biofeedback that we use sometimes where it actually measures heart rate and respiration. It's a little finger sensor. They also make an ear sensor so that the child can kind of actually see visually on a computer how they're doing and how their body changes when they breathe deeply. Jordan Jar, I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. Bottom line here is we're going to do whatever we can to make a difference with these kids. And so sometimes we come up with some pretty weird things, but it's all about the kids. And then there's our newest tools. And FYI, these dogs are not drugged. Okay, they really aren't. Right now, if we were to say either one of their names and get their attention, we could have them do whatever we want. They would be on like that. That is one of the key things with being able to have these dogs involved. And we've got Jordan on the love seat, Tibet on the floor, and Tonks is actually back here underneath the table next to Cindy. They are the 3 courthouse facility dogs in the state of Florida that do this kind of work. So we're really lucky to have them, absolutely. Okay, a little bit about the importance of dogs. How are we doing on time?
It's 5 till 2, so we have till 2:15.
Okay, we're good. Okay, dogs' partnership with man goes back about 30,000 years, and it is a partnership. They were companions, they used each other for protection, man provided dogs with shelter. Dogs are so vigilant and aware of their environment, it really does give us a sense of perceived safety. With these guys settled like this, you know, we automatically assume things are probably okay here. There's nothing bothering them. Now, if one of them was all of a sudden gonna jump up and start barking, wouldn't we all stop and try to figure out what the dog was barking about, what was going on? Okay. That's one of the key things for having dogs with this vulnerable population in CACs in the courts is having a dog that we know is going to be able to react like this when they need to and be up and engaging when they need to. Studies show that having a dog around and involved with people reduces depression, reduces symptoms of PTSD, reduces anxiety, anger, causes a sense of well-being, improves coping. For any of you have dogs at home that when you have a bad day, when you go home, the first thing you do is you go pet your dog, right? Okay. It helps us. We feel better. These dogs have the ability to do that with our kids. Causes physiological changes. Studies have shown reduction in blood pressure, increased oxytocin in the brain, increased endorphins in the brain, and actually a reduction in those cortisol levels that Brenda was talking about earlier. At Kids House, I use Jordan in a variety of ways. She eases anxiety and comforts kids when they're waiting. She helps calm and ground kids prior to therapy sessions. We use it as a reward. Get through our trauma work, then we're going to have playtime with Jordan. She provides a sense of safety, and we found really makes a huge difference with kids that have attachment issues as well as dissociation. So that's kind of a unique thing that we're seeing with her. I mentioned clients and staff. One of the other things that the dogs that are working in these facilities do is help work with our staff and deal with stress. Now this is Jordan with the left pictures in the bottom right. It's actually pictures with our staff. I have people that come into my office regularly. Can I have Jordan time? They saw a really bad case that's going on. I'm like, yeah, I've got a comfy chair in my office, and they come in and sit down, and as soon as they're there, Jordan's like up out of her crate, she walks out, and she's right to them. She has the ability to walk into a meeting and identify who's the most stressed, which amazes our staff at Kids House because they're like, okay, I thought I was hiding it a little bit better than that. So I just keep an eye on what's going on with Jordan, and that tells me who I need to be keeping an eye on as far as staff and who may need a little bit of extra stuff. The top right picture, yes, Jordan likes to give kisses. That's Detective Bowen with Sanford PD up there on the right. And that was actually taken at, we were invited to help, for those of you who are local, you may have seen it, there was a horrible shooting incident in Sanford a few weeks ago. And we were invited to Sanford PD for their debriefing because they thought that Jordan might be able to help the detectives, the road cops, the crime scene techs that were there at the scene. So we spent a couple hours at Sanford PD that day, and you could, as Jordan was going through the room, and initially I walked her through the room, and then I just let her have her head thinking, she'll figure out who needs her. And it was amazing to watch these, big burly cops who were, talking about this whole case and everything that had happened, and you could kind of see, you'd walk up to them, and you could see their whole posture relax. You could see their breathing change as they interacted with her. So we do try to help out with some community stuff too. Okay, here's my little guy. Remember that cave with the sand tray? Okay. This is how that all started. Jason was 6 when he started at Kids House, and he was in therapy for about 9 months, and we weren't getting anywhere. He was having problems at home. He was anxious. He couldn't focus during therapy. Even though we were doing play therapy with him, he was having a lot of difficulty. We decided to try to introduce him to Jordan at the beginning of one of his therapy sessions, and he immediately fell in love with her. And it became very apparent that he really had a bond with her. I'll get to it in a minute. He started talking about her more and more in therapy. And one day, Jordan has a soft crate in my office she can go and she can lay down. And I've got a toddler gate across my door in case I have to leave my office, so she's in there, she's safe. And Jason asked me, he goes, why do you have that gate across your office? And I said, well, my office is Jordan's safe place. So that tells people they need to stay out, and that's Jordan's place. So he thought about that, and he thought that was pretty cool. And he walked into therapy, and he drew the chalk drawing that's on the left, and I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's got a gate, kind of like my toddler gate through it, and behind the gate is Jordan and the little boy. He's got hearts all over. And it gave the therapist an opportunity to actually talk to him about, well, Jason, because he was telling her, he described to her, she wasn't around when we had this conversation about the gate, and so she took the opportunity and she said, well, Jason, where's your safe place? And he thought about it for a minute, and his initial reaction was, I don't have a safe place. And then the therapist just kind of let that go for a second, and he goes, no, that's wrong. I do have a safe place. Jordan's my safe place. I feel safe when I'm with Jordan. And so what we ended up doing is every time he comes for therapy, he spends time with Jordan. He's still having some problems at home. He decided that Jordan felt him feel safe, calm, and happy. And what we ended up doing is we made a Jordan jar for him. And this is a replica of the one that he's got. It's got a picture of Jordan on it, and it's got different colored paper in it. And each of the paper represents one of those feelings, safe, calm, and happy. And what he does when he's at home and he's feeling anxious or angry or frustrated, he pretends to drink from the Jordan jar. This is according to him. He decided how to do this. He pretends to drink from the Jordan jar, and he says that those feelings go down his throat and into his heart, and then he can remember how he feels with Jordan, and so she is with him all of the time. Okay? The power of the dog. And I haven't even shared this with Brenda because it just happened yesterday. He came in and he told the therapist he had a nightmare. And we thought, uh-oh, what's happening? And in his nightmare, Jordan was taken. And he went into a panic. And so their whole session was spent with the idea that, okay, let's talk about Jordan and how Jordan is safe. And so he agreed that I was pretty strong and that I would always protect Jordan. So that I was going to keep Jordan safe. And that because I was going to keep Jordan safe, Jordan wasn't going to get taken away, and Jordan was going to be there for him. And so now he's got 3 people that are now looking out for his safety: his therapist, Jordan, and me. And that was just yesterday. So we're making some headway. He actually is doing much, much better in therapy. Doesn't have the behavior problems at home anymore. And it's all because having this dog was that allowed us to make that difference. We talked about the sensory issues. I mean, Jordan is, we do all kinds of things when it comes to sensory stuff with Jordan, as well as bilateral. If I'm walking around and taking a walk with Jordan and a child, you know, we're moving left and right feet, and we can actually talk about stuff as we're walking. The attention isn't on the child. It really works. That's actually a retention pond in the back of Kid's house. There that we're walking by. Jordan gets dressed up. One of the kids thought she needed a blanket, so do that. Our teens, that's one of our teen girls on the left there, you know, Jordan just goes and curls up in their lap. And what she does depends on the child. She kind of figures that out. I help facilitate, but she figures out what the kid needs. Whether it's sitting down in front of the child and looking up at them and forcing that eye contact, or crawling into their lap, giving them kisses, laying down and let them cuddle around her. I'll tell you about a little boy that we do that with. The difference that she makes is absolutely huge. And we talked about the breathing stuff, you know, Jordan's real calm. And if they breathe in time to Jordan, if they pay attention, they put their hand, they can actually feel her respiration, and then we breathe in time to Jordan. So that helps them, again, it helps them calm. Okay, how am I doing on time?
It is 2:05.
Okay. Just real quick, this little boy is actually adopted from the Ukraine. We do a lot of work with kids who have been adopted out of horrible situations in other countries. We found out he couldn't settle. He was so anxious when he came to Kid's house that he couldn't do any trauma work because he couldn't settle enough. He was so anxious. And so what we did is now he comes with his sister. His sister's appointment is first. So Jordan and I spend the hour that his sister's in therapy, we spend time with him. He cuddles with her. He's always right there. One day he got triggered by a photo in session, a photo that his mom had brought in of the orphanage, and he got triggered and had a really tough time, and they called us into the session. And when Jordan immediately went in and licked his tears and actually laid down with him under a blanket for a good 15 minutes, and then he was fine. but I gave him a picture to take with him, and the next week when we saw him, and that's the picture that's on the chair there, the next week he came in and he said, Miss Denise, I just want you to know, I really like my Jordan picture. That picture I have taken with me everywhere I have gone since you gave it to me. I even take it and put it in my planner so it's with me at school in case I get worried, and then I can pull it out and I can look at Jordan. Okay, and we do all kinds of things to help engage her. Okay, there's actually a series of 4 steps in between here where we've got photographs, but what it was is this can actually be a cute little parlor trick while we're waiting, or those can be feelings cards where Jordan can take the card, hand it to the child and say, okay, this is the feeling we're going to talk about today. So we do fun things like that too. Okay, okay, she's just precious. The difference, I'm sorry, I'm a little biased. The difference that these dogs, all 3 of them, are making in the lives of kids day in and day out is absolutely amazing. We could not make the headway. And I've got 4 therapists that'll tell you any day of the week, you know what? I'm not going to do trauma work with this kid unless Jordan's here. So if I take a day off, some of these kids say, we're not talking about that stuff unless Jordan's here. So it just speaks to the impact that these dogs have. Okay. Now, why we talk about the facility dog model, and please speak up if I leave stuff out, Cindy and Brenda. These dogs are purpose-bred. They're bred for temperament, trainability, health, their physical attributes. Studies say that about 80% of a dog's demeanor can be attributed to their genetics. And what happens with these dogs is between the genes, the learned behaviors that are affected by their environment, with ongoing integration with the behaviors and feedback on those behaviors, we actually have a behavior that we can see and depend on. I know I can put this dog here, I can tell her to stay, and she's going to stay there. And people can walk in and out, and all kinds of things can happen, and I know I can depend on what she's actually doing. These dogs have been trained since birth, and everything they have been exposed to has been tracked. Their puppy raisers had to keep track of absolutely everything that goes on with them. So we know exactly what strategic early life experiences that they had and how they have been socialized to make sure that they can actually do this kind of work. 60% of the dogs, even though they've got the genetics and everything, don't make it through this process. These dogs are trained for normally about 18 months with a person who has been through all kinds of classes and takes them to classes with a puppy raiser. And then they normally have 6 to 9 months of professional training full-time with professional trainers. After that, they go through 2 weeks of training with a handler. And even in that process, and this is one of the things that makes these teams so special, is that for Cindy and Brenda and I to get one of these dogs, we couldn't just say, hey, I'd really like to do this, and how can I, let's just, I'll give you some money, or, we'll figure this out. You have to apply to get an application for one of these dogs. And then you do the application that includes a complete autobiography and pictures of your workspace, your home space, information about everybody that lives in your home, any animals in your home. Then you have a phone interview. If you make it through the phone interview, then you have a full day in-person interview where they actually watch you, how you interact with dogs. And then if you make it through all that, then they invite you to team training, which is 2 weeks of intensive work with these dogs. You have tests every day. You have a written exam at the end of the 2 weeks. And one of the things that you have to do is you have to be able to pass the test. It's actually a field test that are standards according to Assistance Dog International. And that's where a lot of the standardization comes in. The dogs that pass that test, we know exactly what to expect. You know what you're getting with the facility dog. They're certified. Therapy dogs aren't certified in the same way. I had one of the teenagers that actually spends time with Jordan has been through therapy for years and years and years and years and years. And at one point, one of the therapists she went to had a therapy dog. And I asked her, this is when we were first introducing her to Jordan.
Jump. Go ahead. Jump.
Hi, Tibet. Hi, sweetie pie. One of the things that she told me is she said, well, you know, I've been around therapy dogs before. I know what's going on. And so she was sitting and she was petting Jordan, and Jordan just laid there. Jordan rolled over so that she could pet her belly. But, you know, Jordan was interacting with her, and she goes, you know, this is really different. And I'm like, what do you mean? And she said, well, at the other place with the therapy dog, if I pet the therapy dog for too long, she got mad and she nipped at me. And I'm like, okay, Jordan's not going to do that. We know what we're getting with these dogs. And with that being said,
Well, there's a demo I like to do really quick, and it shows how safe these dogs are. Let's face it, we deal in a very litigious society. We might deal with a litigious clientele who are always looking for ways to get more money into their pockets. And we deal with traumatized children, so we want the safest dog possible for traumatized children, and we want a safe dog in terms of liability protection for our programs and for ourselves as handlers. So I had a little girl at court one day, and she had not been around dogs a whole bunch, and she was a little, Tibet, sit. She was a little not sure that she wanted to pet Tibet, and she was kind of keeping her distance. And so I kind of let my guard down and really wasn't paying close attention to her and the dog and their proximity. And I was looking down the hall for someone to arrive, and I looked back down, and the little girl was doing this. Will you hold this?
sure.
She had pried her mouth open and had her... and Tibet's looking at me like, can you help me here? You know? But if I had a dog that had been triggered... She's like, yeah, right?
Hi, sweetie. I know.
Yeah.
I'm distracting.
You know, that could have been a really disastrous situation. I had let my guard down for just a little bit, and that's what happened. So I was just so grateful that day that I had gone to the trouble of getting a facility dog. And these dogs come at no charge. They're worth about $60,000 due to the purpose breeding training that they've received. They come with a $1 million liability policy. And so for our programs, for us as handlers, we want that safety for our kids, and we want safety for our programs. And I think that's, yeah, questions? Yes, ma'am.
How long do they work before they're retired?
If their health holds out, it's usually around 10 years. So Tibet has worked a little over 3 years. She's got another 7 in her. Yes, ma'am.
Do you suggest that some of these kids that are working with these dogs get their own dogs at home?
I get that question a lot. And in fact, thanks. A lot of the kids that we're seeing now, we're seeing an increasing number of kids that are on the autism spectrum. And having part of what we do with Jordan, which is really making a huge difference, I know, I let you up, is actually, no, sit, thank you. Is trying to encourage them to connect. And how we do that varies. Now with Jordan, I do a structured fetch with a lot of those kids where we start out where Jordan sits, and they have to meet Jordan's eyes. And then they can throw her toy. Jordan goes and gets the toy, she brings it back. Jordan has to sit, they have to meet her eyes, they have the command to get that toy away from her, and we do this. It has them connecting with her, as well as a lot of the sensory stuff, petting her. And then we take it from not only do they have to meet Jordan's eyes, but they have to meet my eyes. And so we encourage that. A lot of those caregivers have seen that make such a difference with the kids that they're all about, how do I get one of these dogs? And I don't say that I necessarily recommend, getting one of these dogs is not easy. Well, I am a dog person, so I think every kid should have a dog. That's just me. But I do think that these dogs can make a difference. As long as that dog is a calm dog. Now, if I get a dog that is always excitable, that barks all the time, that tends to nip, now that's going to take a child who we're trying to calm, and it's going to do absolutely the reverse. So when I talk to caregivers about that, because I do spend a lot of time talking to caregivers about how their kids interact with Jordan, because they go home and all they want to do is talk about Jordan. And so that frequently comes up in conversation. But we really kind of take a look at what that would look like in their home. Is it going to cause more stress in their home? That type of thing. But I don't tell people just, okay, everybody needs to go out and get a dog. But they see the difference, and it's a common conclusion that a lot of families get. Yeah, Cindy?
I would say, however, if there was a child that's prone to violence, I would not want to see a dog in a home where there's a lot of violence. That would be the only caveat for that.
Right. And actually, as handlers, now, yeah, I'm a mental health program director. I'm wearing multiple hats. I know Tonks is under there. You see him, don't you? Let's go this way. Let's go. She's like, I didn't see him. One of my jobs, and what we do is a little bit different than some places do. Sit. One of the things that we do is when, at least from the standpoint of the therapy clients, is the therapist is there too. So the therapist looks out for the best interest of the child. I facilitate the interaction, and my job is to make sure my dog is okay, that my dog's not getting stressed, that my dog's not being hurt, because I am there to protect my dog, as well as trying to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the child too. But that's the reason that when I set the program up at Kids House, I deliberately did it where there's actually two people. Now, if we are there in the lobby with kids who are waiting, then it's just me. Then I'm not so worried about it. But with the regular therapy clients, because for one thing, oftentimes they can build on the interaction that Jordan has had with the kids when they actually go in to do a full session.